Throughout this season of Live from the Temple broadcasts, we've been treated to a panorama of repertoire that has introduced us to a number of composers and selections that we don't often hear on symphony orchestra programs. And that diversity of programming continues in glorious form here on our final concert of the season. Once again, there are works on this program that have not previously been performed by the Des Moines Symphony Orchestra, and only one of them has been performed here more than once in the past. There are also some intriguing connections between the works on this program and works that we've heard throughout the season on other concerts. For this Concert Prelude Talk, I'll be focusing on the sounds we're going to encounter on this concert and ideas about how we can listen with an ear toward even greater appreciation for those sounds. But I will talk some about historical context and the composers. To learn so much more, though, about the works, composers, the context in which they were created, please be sure to read Richard E. Rada's program notes in the digital program book. Chances are, even many seasoned classical music fans are not very familiar with the name Mariana Martinez, but she was a well-known figure in the social circles of some of our most beloved classical era composers. Martinez was born and died in Vienna, and probably spent her entire life there. She lived in a house where Franz Joseph Haydn lived upstairs, and she probably studied keyboard with him. We also think that she may have been a keyboard duet partner with Mozart. But so much of her biography remains vague because we don't have a lot of information. Most of what we have is from 11 letters that she left behind, and the other most important documents are the letters of Pietro Metastasio, the important librettist and poet of the time in Vienna, who was a friend, also lived in that house, and they were close enough that when he died, he left his estate to her, providing her with a significant amount of financial security. Now, we do know that Martinez never held an official post as a composer, but this would have been essentially unheard of for a woman of her social class at the time. That financial security she had allowed her to create a substantial body of work that included mostly keyboard, vocal, and liturgical music. Most of her work was lost in a fire in 1927, but we do know for sure that she composed one symphony. And that means that, as far as we know, she was the only woman to compose a symphony in the late 18th century. The symphony is in the Italian style. It's 3 movements, and it reflects a conservative approach to composition that apparently matched her conservative life. And that approach to composition, this conservative manner, probably has more to do with her music not being so well known than other, perhaps more obvious factors. We have to keep in mind that her lifetime saw such remarkably innovative figures as Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, and Schubert. Compared to these freakishly gifted visionaries, most contemporaries of even extraordinary ability are going to struggle to be heard in the subsequent centuries. But does that suggest that Martinez was not an extraordinary composer? Absolutely not. It just needs to be heard in the context of an earlier era, especially in relation to such symphonic pioneers as Giovanni Sammartini and Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach. It's a music that rises from the Baroque tradition, but has a foot firmly in the new classical era style. The first movement begins with a pair of delightful rising arpeggios, but the real fun lies between those arpeggios, where a quick alternating gesture that sounds like a classical shimmy takes place and really propels the music from the outset. For the most part, the music is comprised of scales and arpeggios, what we would expect from an earlier symphonist. They chase each other and they work in conversation with each other. And they're also matched up with the occasional sudden silence that brings a questioning aspect into the music. But the second theme is much more song-like, and it really shows off Martinez's sense of vocal line that is going to serve her so well in her other liturgical music. The third movement is bouncy and dance-like, and it's constructed of jagged rhythms and choppy gestures that evoke excited motion and propel the music all the way to a rousing conclusion. It's music that is very much in the style of the early symphonic tradition. Christoph Willibald Gluck was one of the most important figures in the development of opera. He was a pioneer in the reform movement that sought to put focus back on drama and pull away from the late Baroque emphasis on individual singers. Orfeo ed Euridice was the first of these so-called reform operas, and the subject matter is fitting given that the story of Orpheus was very, very popular amongst the earliest of opera composers, including Jacopo Peri, whose opera Euridice is the earliest surviving opera. Gluck's treatment of the story was first premiered in Vienna in 1762, but the version we're going to be hearing on this program comes from a production in Paris in 1774. Gluck wanted to make changes that would appeal to the Parisian audiences, and amongst the most important things was the addition of a substantial ballet section. In this section, what's happening is Orpheus, who has lost his beloved Eurydice, has passed through the guardians of Hades and finds himself in Elysium. Here, he's looking for Eurydice, and he's surrounded by the beautiful souls and those whom the gods have determined should live forever in happiness. The music is comprised of two sections. The first reflects the calm, soothing simplicity of the Elysian fields. It's a pastoral with a pleasing melody that repeats again and again. The middle section is one of the great flute solos in the repertoire. Here we get a sense of Orpheus's loneliness and instability as he seeks his beloved. That loneliness is manifested in the solo flute, which is accompanied by a pulsing in the strings. The struggle and Orpheus's angst takes shape in the surprising turns of harmony and the way that the flute leans into tones that are dissonant. At times, the flute also makes gestures that are repeated, as if calling out and receiving no response. The result is one of the more stirring moments in the operatic literature. Edvard Grieg's Holberg Suite is one of the most beloved works for the string orchestra, but this is only the second time the Des Moines Symphony Orchestra has performed it. It's a showpiece for strings but it's also a showpiece of orchestration because Grieg originally wrote it for the piano. The suite was commissioned as part of a 200th anniversary celebration for the birth of Danish-Norwegian playwright Ludvig Holberg, who, like Grieg, was born in Bergen, Norway. Grieg premiered the piano suite in 1884, demonstrating both his virtuosity as composer and as pianist, and it was only a year later that he created the orchestra version. Students of orchestration can marvel at how easily Grieg adapts the piano music to the string orchestra. Take, for example, the way it opens with swirling chords in the piano version. Now, these swirling chords are not so idiomatic for string instruments. So what he does is just seamlessly adjust it into a pulsation in the string orchestra that drives it forward much in the way a swirling chord might in the piano. It's a classic study in orchestration for strings. Grieg structures the music after the Baroque suites that would have been performed during Holberg's time and his vision of what that music would be like. The Baroque suite would typically begin with a prelude followed by a series of stylized dances. And in this case, we'll be hearing a preludium and a gavotte and a rigodon. That gavotte features a charming melody that's essentially just comprised of a series of two-note gestures. They string together, rising upward until they are finally met by a descending response. The final movement, rigodon, is a virtuosic showpiece for solo violin and viola. It reflects Norwegian traditions that are reminiscent of the Norwegian national instrument, the Hardanger fiddle, along with providing plenty of opportunity for fireworks from our soloists. Our March concert featured Charles Gounod's Petite Symphonie, a work for small wind ensemble that had been commissioned by the great 19th century French flutist Paul Taffanel. Here on this program, we're also going to be able to enjoy the fruits of Taffanel's efforts to expand the flute repertoire. In 1896, composer Gabriel Fauré joined the faculty of the Paris Conservatory, where Taffanel had already been teaching for 3 years. Every year, Taffanel would commission a new work for a competition to be held at the conservatory, and in 1898 he made the call to Gabriel Fauré. Now, Fauré had few instructions as to exactly what he needed to do, but Taffanel gave him some limits. 1, the work had to be for flute and piano. 2, it had to be less than 6 minutes long. Finally, he said that the work really needed to test the abilities of the flute player in the areas of tone production, phrasing, expression, and virtuosity. Apparently, Fauré really struggled with this commission, and in a letter to his friend and former teacher Camille Saint-Saëns, he described really having a lot of difficulty composing, especially the more technical passages. He said, "I can't think of anything at all that has given me so much trouble." Eventually, he handed the score off to Taffanel with an invitation to adjust things as needed and to get rid of any parts that were unplayable. We don't know what Taffanel did exactly because the manuscript has been lost, but what we do know is that Fauré had delivered exactly what he had been called on to do. He brought forth a piece that really shows off the flute. work is cast in two sections. The first is a slower, gently lilting movement that highlights the player's sense of phrasing and breath control with long singing lines. It's also classic Fantaisie, where harmonic surprises lie around each corner. Oftentimes, the last note of a phrase brings a shift of harmony that seems to open another door into a new musical space. The second movement, the one that gave Toffanel such fits during the composition process, stands in sharp contrast to the first. Instead of the long, luxuriant lines, now we have quick, sprightly gestures that hurtle across the entire range of the instrument with a dazzling array of articulations. It truly fulfills Toffanel's demand for a new work that would demonstrate virtuosity. This is the second time we've heard from William Grant Still this season. In January, we heard the blues from his larger work, Lenox Avenue, where he tapped into American vernacular music in the context of an orchestral suite. On this program, we have another example of Still using folk traditions, only this time he's drawing from Central America. Still had been introduced to the music of Panama by Elizabeth Waldo, a violinist and composer who had lived and worked in Central America for several years in the 1940s and collected instruments and tunes from those traditions. Still decided to score several Panamanian dances together in a 4-movement suite, and we're going to hear 2 of those movements on this program. Those of you who were with us for our September concert may recall Gabriela Lina Frank's Leyendas for string orchestra. It's a work that drew its musical inspiration from the sounds of Andean folk music. And she created sounds with traditional orchestral instruments that hearkened to the sounds of these traditional Andean instruments by calling on the players to use unusual bowings and plucking techniques. Well, William Grant Still, writing 60 years earlier, used a similar approach, only in his score, he's calling on traditional orchestral instruments to emulate the sounds of Panamanian folk instruments. The first movement, Tamborito, draws its name from little drums. It's from a dance tradition where small drums, different sizes of drums, create a heartbeat for the music, and sometimes it's accompanied by guitar and violin. Eventually, it's joined by a solo female soloist who sings long lyrical lines over that heartbeat rhythm. William Grant Still calls on the players to create sounds similar to that by asking them to tap their knuckles on the body of the instruments to create drumming effects. Meanwhile, other string instruments are playing repeated rhythmic ideas to capture the sounds of other drums. Once this framework is established, we get a sensuous, long melody. Eventually gives way back to that opening rhythm and a more vigorous melodic material. And throughout the movements, these ideas work in conversation with each other. The final movement, Cumbia y Congo, again employs the knocking effects along with plucking and aggressive bowing, and it sets up a hearty pulse over which an excited melody starts to take shape, and it drives to a dramatic finale. The music becomes increasingly rowdy, which is appropriate given that it comes from a street dance. What better way to bring our Live from the Temple season to a boisterous conclusion than with a rollicking finale by Mozart? And the last movement of the Paris Symphony fits the bill perfectly. Mozart wrote this work knowing that he wanted to make a big splash when he was in Paris in 1778. He arrived there with his mother. It was shortly after he left his post in Salzburg, and he was seeking employment. The 22-year-old already had an international reputation, but he wanted to be sure that this symphony demonstrated not only his compositional craft, but also his sensitivity to local custom. He also was excited to be writing for the large Parisian orchestra that consisted in this case of 2 of each woodwind, including a pair of clarinets for the first time in a Mozart symphony, along with 2 horns, 2 trumpets, and timpani. It also had a very large string section with 24 violins, 5 violas, 8 cellos, and 5 basses. He was well aware of audience expectations and made sure to begin the symphony with the famed Premier coup d'archet that had been made famous by Jean-Baptiste Lully. The Premier coup d'archet, or the first stroke of the bow, consists of a dramatic gesture wherein all the players of the orchestra start together very loudly. And in his correspondence, Mozart essentially said he didn't see what the big deal was for everybody to all start together, but he noted that he was sure to be careful and not overlook it. Mozart opted for the 3-movement Italian style or French style symphony that didn't include the minuet movement that had become popular in Germany. On this concert, we're going to hear the 3rd and final movement, wherein Mozart included a number of surprises for the audience. He tells us something about the demeanor of the 18th century Parisian audience in a letter where he describes one of the tricks he played. At the very beginning, he starts very, very softly. And he said in the performance, there was a chorus of hush, hush from the audience during this quiet part. But then when it suddenly burst forth with the raucous forte, they also burst forth in applause. Now, this kind of immediate, lively response from an audience was very common at the time, but it's a far cry from what we expect today with a generally quiet symphonic audience. There are wonderful surprises like this throughout the movement, and the excitement is heightened through the extensive use of counterpoint, where simple 2-note ideas seem to chase each other across the orchestra in different instruments. From the initial flurry of fast notes in the second violins, by the way, this is a classic Mozart move to give the seconds handfuls of really fast notes, all the way to the final exuberant chords, the music is driven with joyous enthusiasm. It's a wild ride to the end. And now I invite you to join the Des Moines Symphony Orchestra and Maestro Joseph Giunta for our final concert of this Live from the Temple season, Fantaisie en Français.